So the very bad map we see at every presidential election showing huge swaths of red, I mean, it's flawed and a myth because land doesn't vote, people do. The reality is we are a nation not divided by states, but rather by counties. It's one reason Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for secession isn't just inconceivable as well as foolish. It would be disastrous for Republican voting states. An analysis of the 2020 election by the Brookings Institution showed that Biden's winning base in 500 counties, just 500 counties, encompassed 71% of America's economic activity, while Trump's losing base of 2,500 counties represented just 29% of the economy. And that's because blue states tend to be urban and suburban with large populations, while red counties tend to be smaller, more rural, and sometimes with more cows and corn stalks than people. Economically, it's not even a fair fight. Joining me now are MSNBC political analysts Matthew Dowd and Cornel Belcher. And Matthew, I want to go to you first. This sort of fetish for secession, I remember Sarah Palin's husband was sort of indulging in it. These red state folks keep saying it, but they don't understand the economics of it would really be awful for red states. The states that are the most dependent on the federal government to keep their economies alive are almost all red states: Alaska, Mississippi, Kentucky, West Virginia, Montana, New Mexico, Arizona, Louisiana, Indiana, Alabama. Only New Mexico is a blue state. The least federally dependent states, almost all blue states. Blue states are the donor states: California, Colorado, Massachusetts, you can go on, Illinois, Delaware, New Jersey, et cetera. Why do they keep indulging in this?
Because they don't care about the economic implications of it. I mean, I think that's fundamental to what they're doing and what they've not done in Washington, D.C. What they care about is the cultural implications of this. That's what they fundamentally care about, because they have a singular culture they want to establish. And since they can't do it as the United States as a whole, they want to do it state by state. The other thing, and I found it peculiar that she used this term divorce in this process. And sometimes, as we know, that in a divorce, sometimes the person falls in love with somebody else or another individual and wants out. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene has fallen in love with another country. That happens to be Russia in the course of this. And she likes what's going on in Russia far more than what she likes going on here in the United States. She likes Putin's brand of leadership far more than she likes Joe Biden's brand of leadership. And so that's what I think this is fun. It's a cultural, this is not an economic concern of theirs. This is a cultural concern of theirs. And it fundamentally doesn't understand what it means to be in the United States of America. United States of America. They have no concept of what this means in history. And to me, the shots at Fort Sumter that started the Civil War, we're long past that here in this country right now, because they've jumped already to the place where they want a separate country so they can establish their cultural monotheistic way they want in America.
But I mean, there are a couple ironies here, Cornel. Number one, they would be ruling a country that would still be substantially black. And since we know anti-woke just means anti-black, what would they do with those poor people who'd be stuck there in their world if you really separated it? And number two, by their own definition, their states are takers. They claim they don't like the federal government and they don't like takers. Their own states are wholly dependent on the federal government for survival. So by their own metric, they're already the ones who are in the moral wrong.
Well, it's absurd, Joy. And I think what they would have to do is, quite frankly, what they're already doing in many of these red states, and that is making it harder and harder for people of color to vote and to have political power, right? You know, my father and my family is from rural North Carolina, and one thing my father and always talked about was growing up is that you know, in the South, blacks and whites could always get along. It would just became a problem when blacks wanted power, and I think that continues to be true right now. Is that you would have to see even more draconian measures to sort of disenfranchise and take away black political power, even more so than you do right now. But let's take this out. Let's push this out further. Is that, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene is and many of her friends, you know, with all due respect, they're not even Republicans anymore. They're Confederates.
Yeah.
You know, I went back for the State of the Union. I went back and looked at State of Union speeches by presidents, and even Ronald Reagan talked about the ideal of Republicans and Democrats have to get together to move a legislation that benefits all of America and put aside partisanship. This is not even a party of Ronald Reagan anymore. This is no longer what I could see as a legitimate Republican Party. When you start talking about dividing the country up and breaking the country up, you're a Confederate. You're no longer a Republican.
You know what's interesting, though, Matthew, my poor team has been forced to hear about this all day, but I feel like what's happening is sort of a coddling of the conservative mind. The conservatives don't have the confidence that their ideas can be sold on the basis of presenting them just as ideas. And so they've decided we can't convince people to do what we want and to live by our particular religious dictums. So we're going to tell the federal government, enforce it. I don't like this book, ban it. I don't like drag shows, make them illegal. The things that I personally feel uncomfortable with, I don't feel confident that I can convince people to come to my side. So I need the power of the federal government to ban the things that make me uncomfortable. That to me strikes me as a sort of intellectual collapse and a sense of defeat.
Well, Joy, I'm really glad you brought this point up because I've been thinking about this a lot, all of us have been observers or in politics for decades in this course of this. I can't remember a time when one political party or the leaders of the political party abandoned persuasion.
Yeah.
Abandon persuasion as a mode of leadership. What they've decided is, just like you said, they can't persuade a majority of America to move in a certain direction, which is where they want to go, which in my view, and I've said this before, is a form of Christian nationalism they want to establish here. So what they do is, since they can't persuade and they no longer want to persuade, they go to force. And every single leader that's emerged, Donald Trump, DeSantis, others, it's not an art of persuasion, it's an art of force. And that's where we are. And when you abandon persuasion and you go to force, then democracy is frayed and is broken. And when your major political party no longer believes in persuasion.
They're like missionaries. They're like religious missionaries who use torture as their form of conversion. Because they actually don't have enough.
They're more like
the crusaders. Absolutely. And Cornel, that is the one way to turn even more people away.
Oh, I think this is when she said that, and when the Republican leadership roundly did not come out and condemn it, I thought, my God, and I hate to think this way, but it's also, Joy, a political opportunity. Because look, there's a whole amount of research some that I've been involved with that shows Americans are actually really concerned about another civil war in this country. And they don't want another civil war in this country. And the vast majority of Americans still hold on to the hope that even as divided as we are, we have more in common than not, and that we are stronger together. And I like the ideal of Joe Biden going into re-election as standing, and by the way, his speech they gave in Eastern Europe, I thought was brilliant, because he talked about democracy and he talked about standing up for democracy, and he talked about taking on the autocrats. And if this Confederate party that is now emerging on the right is going to be the party of Putin and autocracy and anti-democracy against democracy, they are handing Joe Biden and Republicans an issue.
Absolutely. And I hate to break it to Marge, but her state would be with the Union. Has she been to Atlanta lately? Y'all state ain't a red state no more, Mama.
She's going to be one of the children. She's going to be one of the children that's divorced, left without a home.
Listen, Matthew Dowd and Cornel Belcher, thank you both very much.